Wipe it off the floor. Maybe then you will remember where you belong. The words did not echo because the room was already too quiet. A crystal wineglass spun once across the marble beside Alana Brooks's shoes, its stem catching the chandelier light like a warning. 12 wealthy guests sat frozen around the Whitmore dining table, pretending not to stare while a ribbon of red wine bled across the white linen runner. Edward Whitmore stood at the head of it all with one hand in his pocket and a half-smile on his face, looking less like a grieving father and more like a man enjoying the shape of someone else's humiliation. He did not raise his voice. Men like Edward never had to. Power, when it has been inherited long enough, learns how to whisper and still make a room obey. "Well?" he said, swirling the dark wine in his glass as if this were entertainment instead of cruelty. "Or is cleaning suddenly beneath you?" A few people shifted in their seats. One woman reached for her water and missed the stem the first time. A man near the center of the table stared too hard at his plate, as if roasted sea bass might save him from having to be human. Nobody spoke. Nobody told him to stop. That was the ugliest part. Not the insult. Not even the way he had chosen this exact moment, under candlelight and old money and polished silver, to remind a black maid that in his house, dignity was apparently optional if your paycheck was small enough. It was the audience. Alana stood in her pressed black uniform with a folded white cloth in one hand and her shoulders straight beneath the weight of a dozen watching eyes. She had spent 4 months inside the Whitmore estate learning how to move quietly through rooms built to make people like her disappear. She knew which guests liked sparkling water with no ice, which corners of the library trapped dust by noon, which flowers Mrs. Whitmore used to prefer before the funeral arrangements replaced them with lilies too white to feel alive. And she knew exactly what Edward was doing now. This was not about a spill. It was never about a spill. It was about a man who had built his whole identity on control and could not stand the sight of someone beneath him carrying dignity he could not buy. "Get on your knees and clean it," he said again, softer this time, which somehow made it worse. The red stain widened across the linen like a wound no one wanted to claim. Alana lowered her eyes to it, not in surrender, but in stillness. Her fingers tightened once around the cloth. She could feel the room waiting for one of two things: a breakdown or obedience, tears or apology, some visible proof that his power had landed where he intended. But Alana gave them none of it. She did not flinch. She did not plead. She did not even let embarrassment borrow her face. She only bent slightly, the hem of her uniform brushing the cold marble, and in that exact second a small sound broke through the silence from the far end of the table. It was not loud, just a child's sharp inhale, thin and frightened. But Alana heard it instantly. So did every nerve in her body. She turned before anyone else even realized something was wrong. 8-year-old Lila Whitmore had gone pale in her chair, her little hands pressed tightly over her ears, her breathing quick and uneven. Her untouched peas still lined up in a neat green row on the china plate in front of her. The room, which had just been enjoying someone else's humiliation, suddenly looked helpless. One guest half stood. Another whispered, "Oh my God!" But Alana did not wait for permission. The cloth slipped from her hand onto the marble as she crossed the room in 2 quick steps and dropped to one knee beside the little girl. "Lila," she said softly, steady as warm light, "look at me, sweetheart. Not the room. Just me." And for the first time that night, Edward Whitmore was no longer the most powerful person in the house. Alana moved before anyone else did. The white cloth in her hand never touched the wine. Instead, she crossed the marble floor in 2 quiet steps and dropped to one knee beside Lila, just as the little girl pressed both palms over her ears. The room, so polished a moment ago, cracked around the edges. Crystal trembled from the scrape of chairs. Someone whispered, "What is happening?" Another guest reached for their phone, then thought better of it. But Alana did not look at any of them. She kept her eyes on the child. "Lila," she said softly, low enough that the words seemed to stay between them. "Look at me, sweetheart. Not the room. Just me." The girl's chest was rising too fast, her small shoulders tight as drawn wire beneath the pale blue fabric of her party dress. The sound of too many voices, too much silverware, Too much forced laughter had finally become more than she could hold. Alana had seen it building all evening in the tiny things adults always missed. The untouched food, the rigid posture, the way Lila blinked too hard whenever someone laughed too loudly, the way she flinched every time a new guest touched her shoulder and called her darling like children were decorative objects at grown-up tables. Alana had known this would happen 20 minutes ago. She had just hoped the night would end before the pressure found a crack. "Can somebody get water?" one of the women asked in a voice too sharp to be useful. "No," Alana said, still calm, still focused, and the firmness in her tone startled even herself. No one crowed her. That was the first time several people in the room had heard her speak more than a polite yes, sir, or right away, ma'am. Her voice was warm, grounded, and impossible to ignore. Lila's fingers trembled against the sides of her head. Alana slowly opened one hand in front of the child, palm up, not touching, just offering the shape of steadiness. "You are safe," she whispered. "You are not in trouble. Breathe with me." She inhaled once, deep and visible, then exhaled slowly enough for a frightened child to follow. Lila did not do it at first. Her eyes were wet and unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond the room, beyond the people, beyond the gold light and polished silver and expectations she was too young to name. Then Alana did it again. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, predictable, gentle, a rhythm. The kind children trusted before they trusted words. And finally, Lila's breathing shifted. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for the panic to stop climbing. Enough for the room to feel less like a trap. "There you go," Alana murmured. "That is it. Stay with me." Edward Whitmore had not moved until then. He stood at the head of the table with his wineglass still in hand, his expression unreadable in the chandelier light. But something had changed in his face. Not softness. Not yet. Just confusion. The kind that comes when a person who thinks they understand every room suddenly realizes the most important thing happening in it is beyond their control. "Alana," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded less like recognition than interruption. "Step back." She looked up at him once, not defiant, not apologetic, just steady. "She needs quiet," she said. It was not a challenge. It was a fact. That was what made it dangerous. Edward's jaw tightened. The guests had gone almost completely silent now, each one pretending not to witness the exact moment authority began slipping in a room built to flatter it. A man in a charcoal suit lowered his fork. A woman near the center of the table folded her napkin in her lap and stared at it as if linen could rescue her from discomfort. Across the room, one of the catering assistants had frozen beside the sideboard, holding a tray of untouched dessert plates like she was afraid even porcelain could make things worse. Lila's small hand reached out then, blind with instinct, and caught the fabric at Alana's sleeve. She held on. Not tightly, not dramatically, just enough to make the entire room understand what Edward had not. The child had chosen her. And for one breathless second, no one cared about the spilled wine anymore. No one cared about the guests or the menu or the social choreography of old money and polished manners. All that remained was a frightened little girl clinging to the one person in the room who had not asked her to perform. Alana lowered her voice even more. "Can you count with me?" she asked. "Just to 5. That is all." 1. Lila swallowed hard. 2, Alana said. The child's lips parted. 3. A shaky whisper came out. Barely audible. But it was there. The first sign she was returning. Edward stared at them both as if he had just walked into his own house and discovered it belonged to someone else. Edward moved at last, and the shift in the room was immediate. The same guests who had been frozen in place now straightened in their seats, relieved to hand the moment back to the man they understood. Control in houses like this was not measured by kindness. It was measured by who everyone expected to obey. He set his wineglass down with a soft click against the table and stepped around the spill without looking at it, his polished shoes making almost no sound on the marble. "That is enough," he said, and the cold authority in his voice seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room by 10 degrees. Alana did not argue. She only kept one hand open near Lila, close enough to reassure, far enough not to crowd. The little girl's breathing had almost settled. Her fingers were still wrapped in the fabric of Alana's sleeve. "She is calming down," Alana said quietly. "She just needs a minute." Edward's expression hardened in a way that told everyone at the table this had stopped being about his daughter and started becoming about something else. Pride had entered the room. And pride, unlike panic, always wanted witnesses. "I said step away from her." His tone was still controlled, but there was strain underneath it now, something tight and almost brittle. Lila looked up at him with wide, damp eyes, then tightened her grip on Alana's sleeve instead of letting go. That tiny movement, so small most people would have missed it, landed like a public correction. Edward saw it. So did everyone else. Alana rose slowly to her feet, careful not to pull away too fast and unsettle the child. "Sir," she said, soft but steady. "She is not trying to be difficult." She got overwhelmed. It was the wrong sentence for a man like Edward Whitmore, not because it was disrespectful, but because it suggested understanding he had not earned. He looked at Alana as if she had crossed some invisible line he had drawn long before she ever entered his home. "You seem to have forgotten what your job is," he said. A guest near the center of the table shifted uncomfortably. Another lowered her eyes. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody ever did. "My job," Alana answered, "is to help where I am needed." The words were plain. No edge, no attitude. But plain truth can sound like rebellion to people who are used to being obeyed. Edward's jaw flexed once. "Your job is to clean this house," he said, "not to insert yourself into private family matters." Across the room, one of the waitstaff glanced toward Mrs. Green, the house manager, who had just appeared in the doorway from the service hall. The older woman took in the room in a single practice sweep. The stain on the table, the guests holding their breath. Lila still half-turned toward Alana. Edward standing too straight. Mrs. Green had worked in large houses for nearly 30 years. She knew the difference between a social misstep and a moral failure, and this was quickly becoming the second one. But she said nothing. Women like her learned long ago that truth did not always survive in rich men's dining rooms. Alana felt the shift too. She could sense the exact second the room stopped caring whether Lila was all right and started caring whether Edward felt challenged. That was the way power protected itself. It moved the focus, changed the subject. It turned pain into inconvenience and compassion into insubordination. Lila tugged at Alana's sleeve again, more urgently this time. "Please do not go," she whispered, and though her voice was barely audible, in the hush of that room it might as well have rung from the chandeliers. A woman near the far end of the table pressed her lips together. Someone else exhaled sharply through their nose. Edward's face changed then, not into anger exactly, but into something worse. Embarrassment. The polished kind. The kind that arrives wearing a tie and decides to punish the nearest person for making it visible. "Lila," he said, too quickly, "that is enough." But the child was already shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice thin but clear. "No, she helps me." Alana felt the room tilt. Not physically, morally. She knew what came next because she had lived enough life to recognize when a powerful person had just been contradicted by someone too honest to understand the danger of it. Edward took one more step forward and extended his hand toward his daughter, but she did not take it. Instead, she leaned slightly toward Alana, not dramatically, just instinctively, the way children move toward safety before they know they are making a choice. That was when Edward's eyes flicked up to Alana's face, and for the first time that night, there was no performance left in his expression. Only offense. Deep, personal, humiliating offense. "You have done quite enough for one evening," he said. His voice was low now, almost silky. "That was never a good sign. Go downstairs." Immediately, the room went still again, but this time it was a different kind of stillness. Not shock, anticipation. Everyone could feel it now. The line had been crossed. The question was no longer whether Alana had done the right thing. The question was whether doing the right thing in Edward Whitmore's house would cost her everything before the night was over. Alana did not move right away. Not because she wanted to defy him, and not because she did not understand exactly what was happening. She stayed because Lila was still watching her with the wide, fragile look of a child trying to decide whether safety could disappear as quickly as it had arrived. In houses like this, children learned the truth long before adults admitted it. They learned who comforted and who controlled. They learned whose footsteps made their shoulders tighten. They learned which smiles were real and which ones came with consequences. Alana had seen enough of Lila over the past 4 months to know that this little girl had become fluent in silence. That was what made her voice now feel almost sacred. "Please," Lila whispered again, her fingers tightening around the black fabric at Alana's wrist. "Do not go." The words were soft, but they landed with a force that changed the room. A man near the center of the table lowered his eyes into his water glass as if it might spare him from witnessing what came next. One woman shifted in her chair and folded her napkin with the neat panic of someone trying to keep her hands busy while her conscience did something inconvenient. The candlelight flickered across polished silver and crystal stems, but the warmth had drained from the evening completely. Even the string quartet drifting in from the adjacent parlor had fallen into some distant, irrelevant thing, like music from another house where people still knew how to behave. Edward Whitmore stared at his daughter, and for one suspended second, something almost human crossed his face. Not tenderness, more like disbelief. The expression of a man who had spent years paying for the best schools, the best doctors, the best tutors, the best grief counselors, and was now being publicly reminded that none of it had purchased what he wanted most: trust. He looked back at Alana, and the softness vanished so fast it almost felt like a trick of the light. "Lila," he said, his voice sharpened now by embarrassment he could no longer hide beneath polish. "You will let go of her this instant." But the child shook her head. Not dramatic, not loud, just once. Honest and terrified and absolutely clear. No, it was a small word, but in a room where everyone had spent the last 20 minutes obeying his mood, it sounded almost seismic. Alana could feel the danger of it before anyone else seemed willing to. Edward was not the kind of man who erupted. He constricted. He narrowed. He became colder the moment he felt exposed. And right now, in front of investors, old family friends, and the kind of people who remembered everything but only repeated it behind closed doors, he had just been contradicted by the only person in the house whose love could not be bought back with a donation or a new pony or a weekend in Aspen. Mrs. Green took one step into the room from the service doorway, not enough to interrupt, just enough to be seen. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned into a clean twist and a face that looked carved from patience. "Sir," she said carefully, the single syllable laid down like a napkin over broken glass. Perhaps Miss Whitmore would be more comfortable in the library for a few minutes. It was the closest thing to rescue the room had offered all night. Edward did not even look at her. "I did not ask for a suggestion," he said. Mrs. Green went still. Alana felt Lila flinch beside her. That did it. Whatever line Alana had been trying not to cross, whatever instinct for self-preservation had kept her careful and quiet and professionally invisible in this house for months, it shifted under her feet. She did not raise her voice. She did not harden it. She simply said the thing that was true. "Sir, she is frightened." The sentence itself was gentle. But truth has a way of humiliating people who rely on control more than character. Edward's gaze locked onto her face. "And you seem to have decided," he said, each word clipped clean, "that your opinion belongs at this table." Alana met his eyes for the first time that evening, not because she wanted to challenge him, but because lowering them now would have made Lila feel abandoned. "No, sir," she answered quietly. "But your daughter does." Something in the room gave way. It was invisible, but everyone felt it. The man with the water glass stopped pretending to drink. The woman with the folded napkin went perfectly still. Even the catering assistant by the dessert cart lifted her head. Edward's face did not change much, which somehow made the moment more dangerous. He had the kind of wealth that taught a man to keep his expressions expensive. But his silence sharpened around the edges. "Take your hand off my child," he said. Alana glanced down. She had not realized Lila had reached for her again. Small fingers curled tightly around two of hers like she was anchoring herself to the only thing in the room that felt steady. Very slowly, Alana loosened her hand without pulling away too fast. "Lila," she said, her voice low enough to keep the moment from turning theatrical. "I am right here." The child's chin trembled. "You are going to leave." "Not until you are calm," Alana whispered. "I promise." Edward heard that. Of course he did. And the promise in her voice seemed to offend him more than any defiance could have. Because promises were intimate things. Trust was intimate. And somehow, in a single disastrous dinner, the black maid he had just tried to humiliate had become the one person his daughter believed. He drew in a breath, slow and cold, and when he spoke again, the room seemed to brace around him. "You are done here for the night," he said. "After dinner, collect your things. We will discuss whether you are done here for good." The words landed with the kind of precision only wealthy men mistake for restraint. "We will discuss whether you are done here for good." No shouting. No slammed fist. No scene dramatic enough to make anyone intervene. Just the polished threat of a man who had spent his life learning how to make cruelty sound administrative. For one suspended second, no one in the dining room moved. Not even the guests. That was how shame worked in places like this. It did not rush in all at once. It spread slowly, like spilled wine, asking every witness a quiet question about who they were willing to become in order to stay comfortable. Lila still stood beside Alana, her small fingers twisted in the fabric at her side, while the adults around them avoided looking directly at the one person who had actually helped. A woman at the far end of the table lifted her napkin to her lap with shaking hands. One of Edward's investors stared into his untouched bourbon, as if amberglass could save him from having to own what he had just watched. Another guest gave the kind of weak smile people wear when they know they should say something and decide not to. Even the candles seemed to burn more carefully now, their reflections wavering in the crystal stemware like the room itself was losing confidence. Edward noticed all of it. That was what made him colder. Because power can survive defiance much more easily than it can survive doubt. The moment he realized the room was no longer fully with him, his voice sharpened into something cleaner, more dangerous. Not louder, just final. "Lila," he said, extending his hand with the practiced certainty of a man used to being obeyed on sight. "Come here." The child looked at his hand, then at Alana, then slowly let go. Not because she wanted to. Because children can feel when adults are too fragile to be contradicted any further. She crossed the few feet between them with careful little steps, and when Edward rested his hand on her shoulder, the gesture looked protective from a distance. Up close, it looked like control trying to wear the costume of care. "Dinner is over," he announced to the table without looking directly at anyone. "I apologize for the interruption." That was the moment the room truly changed. Because he did not apologize for his daughter's fear, or for the humiliation he had engineered 2 feet from where she sat. He apologized for inconvenience, for discomfort, for the disruption of a carefully curated evening. The distinction was so clean it almost made Alana dizzy. Chairs shifted, silverware clinked. The social machinery restarted itself in ugly little sounds. Guests began gathering their composure, their purses, their coats, their ability to call this unfortunate instead of wrong. One woman finally rose and murmured something about an early flight. A man checked his watch too theatrically. Another guest, a white-haired donor who had laughed earlier, could not seem to meet Alana's eyes now. They were leaving with full stomachs and clean reputations, while the person who had done the right thing was being escorted toward uncertainty. That was how systems protected themselves. They made goodness expensive and cruelty socially survivable. Alana lowered her gaze, not out of shame, but because survival sometimes required a graceful exit. "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice did not shake. That seemed to bother him more than anything else. She turned toward the service hall with the white cloth still in her hand, the one meant for the wine that had started all of this and never got cleaned. The dark red stains still spread across the runner in the middle of the table, catching candlelight like dried lacquer. No one reached for it. Somehow, after everything, the spill had become too honest to touch. As she passed Mrs. Green in the doorway, the older woman's face remained composed, but her eyes flicked once toward Alana's hand, then to her face, then back again. It was not sympathy exactly, more like recognition. The kind older women gave younger ones when they had seen the same story in 100 different houses with 100 different chandeliers. "Go to the back kitchen," Mrs. Green said quietly. "I will handle the floor staff." Alana nodded and kept walking. The service corridor beyond the dining room was dimmer, narrower, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and warm bread. Behind her, the sound of the party trying to recover itself softened into a muffled blur of silverware, low conversation, and the kind of brittle laughter that only appears after something shameful has already happened. But one sound followed her farther than the rest. Small, fragile, nearly swallowed by distance. Lila's voice. "Daddy." "She helped me." Edward did not answer. Alana did not turn around. She just kept walking because sometimes the hardest thing about dignity is carrying it out of a room that did not deserve it. In the back kitchen, the overhead lights were softer than the chandeliers, almost tired. A dishwasher hummed in the corner. A stockpot sat cooling on the stove. Someone had left a towel folded neatly beside the sink. Everything in the room looked painfully normal. That was the part that nearly undid her. Not the insult, not the threat. The normalcy of stainless steel and folded aprons after being reduced, in front of a dozen people, to a position he thought she should accept. Without flinching, she set the white cloth on the counter and stared at the faint tremor in her fingers. Not fear exactly, more like the body's delayed response to staying composed longer than it should have had to. "Miss Brooks." The voice came from behind her. Alana turned and found one of the younger catering assistants standing in the doorway, still holding an untouched tray of miniature lemon tarts. The girl could not have been older than 22. Her ponytail had loosened, and her mascara looked one blink away from defeat. "I just wanted to say," she stopped, swallowed. "What you did for Miss Lila was really kind." Alana looked at her for a second, then gave the smallest smile she had left. "Thank you," she said. The girl nodded too quickly, embarrassed by her own sincerity, then hurried off with the tray still in her hands. Alana turned back to the sink and braced both palms against the steel edge. Above it, the small square window over the prep station reflected a dim version of her face back at her. Calm, tired, intact. That last part mattered. In a house like this, there were moments designed to make a person abandon themselves, to apologize for things that were not wrong, to shrink so someone else could feel large again. But Alana had not raised her voice. She had not pleaded. She had not given him the chaos he expected from someone he had tried to put in her place. And somehow, she knew that had unsettled Edward Whitmore more than any argument could have. She reached for the faucet and turned on the water. It ran hot, then hotter, steaming faintly against the steel basin. She rinsed the cloth beneath the stream and watched the dark red wine bleed into the drain in long twisting ribbons. For a second, she thought of how quickly expensive things stained white fabric. How impossible some marks looked until enough water and patience touched them. Then footsteps sounded again in the hall. Heavier this time. Slower. Not staff. Alana did not turn around immediately. She already knew who it was before his reflection appeared in the small square window above the sink, standing still behind her in the kitchen light. Edward Whitmore did not belong in the back kitchen. Men like him were designed for polished oak studies, private clubs, and dining rooms, where other people cleared the plates before they cooled. Under the softer fluorescent lights, with stainless steel counters reflecting a dull silver and the low hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, he looked almost unfinished. Not smaller, just less convincing. Alana kept her hands beneath the running water for 1 second longer than necessary, then turned off the faucet and folded the damp cloth once over her fingers. She still did not face him fully. She only watched his reflection in the little square window above the sink, where the glass turned both of them into faint, tired versions of themselves. "I told you to go downstairs," he said at last. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the audience that had sharpened it upstairs. Without the dining room and the guests and the performance of being a man in charge, the words sounded flatter. Less like power, more like habit. Alana set the cloth beside the sink. "I did," she answered. "This is downstairs." That should not have been funny. It was not meant to be. But something in the plainness of it hung in the room for a beat too long, and Edward's expression tightened in a way that told her he had heard the truth in it. He stepped farther into the kitchen. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough to make it clear he had followed her here for a reason. "Do not mistake tonight for permission," he said. "Whatever connection you think you have with my daughter, it does not change your role in this house." There it was. Not concern. Not even anger anymore. Just the frantic need to put things back into the boxes that made him comfortable. Rich man. Employee. Owner. Staff. White. Black. Above. Below. Order was a fragile religion in places like this, and tonight Alana had disrupted it without ever raising her voice. She turned then, slowly, and faced him properly for the first time since the dining room. Her expression was not hard. That was what made it difficult for him. Hardness he would have known how to punish. Bitterness he could have dismissed. But calm? Calm left a man alone with himself. "I do not think I have anything, sir," she said quietly. "I think your daughter was scared." The kitchen seemed to exhale around them. The dishwasher clicked into a new cycle in the corner. Somewhere farther down the service hall, a cartwheel squeaked once and kept going. Edward looked away first, just for a second, toward the prep table where a bowl of untouched dinner rolls sat beneath a linen towel. "She has specialists," he said. "She has routines. She has support." Alana nodded once. "I know. Then you should also know," he continued, and now the steel was back in his voice, though not as clean as before, "that it is not your place to step in and make yourself essential." That one landed exactly where he meant it to, not because it was true, but because it revealed the fear beneath all the control. Essential. The word itself gave him away. Alana held his gaze for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice remained so soft it almost made the sentence feel merciful. "Children do not cling to people because they are trying to make a point," she said. "They cling to who feels safe." The silence after that was so complete it seemed to strip the room down to its bones. Edward did not speak, did not move. The overhead lights caught in the silver at his temples and turned it almost white. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a man in command and more like someone standing at the edge of a truth he did not know how to survive. But then the armor came back. Of course it did. Men who built their lives around control rarely surrendered it all at once. "You are overstepping," he said, but the force had gone out of it. It sounded like a sentence he needed more than one he believed. Alana did not answer immediately. She reached for the cloth again and folded it one more time, slower now, careful and neat, as if dignity could be pressed flat if handled gently enough. Then she looked up. "No, sir," she said. "I am just not pretending." Something flickered across his face then. Not rage. Something more unstable than that. Recognition, maybe, or offense at being seen too clearly by someone he had already decided was beneath him. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, something final, something that would restore the old shape of things. But before he could, footsteps came quickly down the service hall. Small ones, fast, familiar, and, a second later, Lila's voice reached them from just beyond the doorway, breathless and trembling in the quiet. "Miss Brooks." Lila did not slow down when she reached the doorway. Her small shoes tapped quickly against the tile, her breath uneven but determined, as if she had run past every quiet rule in the house to get here before something important disappeared. "Miss Brooks," she said again, softer this time, like she was afraid the words might arrive too late. Alana turned immediately, the tension in her shoulders loosening just enough for something warmer to return to her face. "I am right here," she said, and the steadiness in her voice seemed to anchor the room before anything else could. Lila stepped into the kitchen fully now, her hair slightly out of place, her hands empty, her eyes fixed only on Alana as if the rest of the world had blurred out of focus. Edward did not speak. He remained where he stood, near the edge of the prep table, watching the moment unfold in a way that felt unfamiliar even to himself. There was no script for this, no business instinct, no negotiation tactic, just a quiet, undeniable shift. He could not interrupt without breaking something he was beginning to recognize as fragile. "They said you left," Lila said, her voice trembling at the edges. "They said you were going to leave." Alana knelt slightly so she was closer to the child's height, not touching her yet, just lowering herself into the same space. "I have not gone anywhere," she said gently. "I told you I would stay until you felt calm." Lila swallowed hard, her small chest rising and falling again, but not like before. Not panicked, just uncertain. "Are you still in trouble?" she asked, and the question was so direct it seemed to move through the room without resistance, landing somewhere Edward could not ignore. Alana paused for half a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the weight of honesty in a child's world. "I do not think helping someone feel safe is something to be in trouble for," she said quietly. Lila nodded, as if that made sense in a way the rest of the night had not. Then, without asking, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Alana's waist. It was not dramatic. No tears, no collapse. Just a simple, certain choice. The kind children make when they decide where they belong in a moment. Alana's hands hovered for a fraction of a second before she gently rested one hand on the child's back. Careful, respectful, present. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Edward's gaze shifted between them, something inside him tightening and loosening at the same time. He had spent years structuring this house so that nothing unexpected could take root. Every schedule, every tutor, every carefully selected professional had been placed like furniture, arranged to prevent exactly this kind of unpredictable connection. And yet here it was. Not hired, not designed, not controlled, just real. "Lila," he said finally, and his voice sounded different now, not softer, but less certain of its own authority. The child did not let go. She only turned her head slightly, enough to hear him without breaking the moment. "You should be upstairs," he added, though the words felt thinner than they had before. Lila shook her head once, her cheek still resting against Alana. "I am okay here." The simplicity of it carried more truth than anything else said that night. Edward looked at Alana then, not with the sharpness from the dining room, but with something unsettled, something that did not fit easily into his understanding of how things worked. "You see what you have done," he said, though it sounded less like an accusation and more like a question he did not know how to finish. Alana met his eyes, still calm, still steady, still refusing to step into the version of conflict he seemed to need. "No, sir," she said. "I see what she needed." The words did not rise. They did not push. They simply remained. And for the first time that evening, Edward did not immediately respond. The silence stretched, not tense, but reflective, like a surface finally still enough to show what had been there all along. He glanced down at his daughter again, at the way her shoulders had finally relaxed, at the absence of fear in her posture, at the quiet trust that had settled into the room like something earned rather than imposed. And in that moment, something shifted inside him that no audience could have forced and no authority could have commanded. It was not surrender, not yet, but it was the beginning of recognition. And recognition, once it arrives, does not leave quietly. Edward did not move for several seconds after Alana's words settled into the room. It was not the kind of silence that demanded attention. It was the kind that quietly rearranged it. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of cooling metal, even the distant clink of dishes being cleared upstairs all seemed to recede behind something more difficult to ignore. His daughter was no longer trembling. Her shoulders, which had been tight enough to signal fear to anyone who knew how to look, had softened into something closer to ease. And she was still holding on to the woman he had just threatened to dismiss. Not because she was told to, not because she had been guided, but because she had chosen to. Edward exhaled slowly, though he had not realized he had been holding his breath. "Lila," he said again, but this time there was no edge in it, no expectation that the word itself would carry authority. The child lifted her head slightly, just enough to look at him, her arms still loosely around Alana. "Are you still scared?" he asked, and even he seemed surprised by the question as it left him. Lila thought about it. Actually thought. Not rushed, not corrected. "Not right now," she said. It was a simple answer, but it did something no boardroom victory ever had. It removed him from the center of the moment. Alana did not speak. She did not shift. She only remained exactly where she was, present but not imposing, steady without asking to be recognized. That steadiness had become something else now. Not just comfort. Contrast. Edward looked at her again. Really looked this time. Not as an employee or a problem to be managed, but as the person his daughter had trusted without hesitation. There was no performance in her posture. No attempt to claim anything. She had not asked for acknowledgement, and somehow that made it unavoidable. "You said you were not pretending," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all evening. It did not sound like a challenge anymore. It sounded like he was testing the weight of the sentence. Alana met his gaze without resistance. "No, sir," she answered. "I did not pretend she was fine when she was not." The words were simple, but they carried something heavier now. Not accusation, just truth that refused to step aside. Edward's hand, which had been resting loosely at his side, tightened slightly, then relaxed again. The reflex to control, to correct, to re-establish order flickered through him, but it did not land the same way. Not here. Not with his daughter watching. Not with the evidence of her calm standing directly in front of him. He took a step closer, then stopped, as if unsure where to place himself in a moment that did not revolve around him. "Lila," he said carefully, "it is late. You should rest." The child hesitated this time, her eyes shifting between him and Alana, measuring something invisible. "Can she come say goodnight?" she asked, her voice softer now but certain. It was not a request shaped by fear. It was a condition shaped by trust. Edward blinked once, the smallest interruption in his composure. That was new. Conditions were not something he was used to receiving, especially not from someone so small. For a brief second, the old instinct returned. Refuse. Redirect. Reclaim. But then he looked again. Really looked. At the absence of tension in her shoulders. At the quiet steadiness in her breathing. At the way her fingers had relaxed against Alana's uniform, no longer gripping, just resting. Something in that image did not fit with the version of control he had relied on for years. It did not respond to authority. It responded to presence. And presence, he was beginning to understand, could not be demanded. It had to be given. "All right," he said finally. The words came out slower than expected, as if they had to pass through something unfamiliar on their way out. Lila nodded once, satisfied in a way that required no further negotiation. She stepped back from Alana then, not abruptly, not reluctantly, just enough to stand on her own again. The choice remained visible even as the contact ended. Alana rose to her full height, her movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing about the evening required dramatizing. She looked down at Lila and offered a small, reassuring smile. "I will come up in a few minutes," she said. Lila accepted that easily, turning toward the hallway without looking back this time. She walked out the way children do when they feel certain someone will follow, her steps no longer rushed, no longer uncertain. The sound of her footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving the kitchen quieter than before. Edward remained where he was, his gaze lingering on the doorway long after she had gone. When he finally looked back at Alana, there was no sharpness left in his expression, only something unsettled, something incomplete. "You made that look simple," he said. It was not praise, not quite, more like an observation he did not know how to categorize. Alana shook her head slightly. "It is not simple," she replied. "It just is not complicated." That answer stayed in the air between them, unadorned and difficult to dismiss. Edward glanced toward the sink, where the cloth now rested clean and folded, the earlier stain gone without a trace. For a moment, he seemed to focus on that, on the absence of what had been there before, on how easily something visible could disappear when handled with the right kind of attention. Then he looked back at her, and for the first time that evening, there was no immediate response waiting behind his eyes. Only the quiet realization that whatever power he thought he had shown upstairs had not followed him into this room, and whatever had replaced it did not need his permission to remain. Alana waited until Lila had disappeared down the hallway before she reached for the folded cloth again, more out of instinct than necessity. Her hands liked small tasks when the room around her became too full of things no one knew how to say. Edward was still standing near the prep table, one palm resting lightly against the steel edge, not because he needed support, but because for once he did not seem to know what to do with his hands. The kitchen lights flattened everything equally. Stainless steel, white tile, expensive shoes, worn work flats. In that room, wealth did not glow the way it did under chandeliers. It just stood there, stripped of ceremony, looking almost ordinary. "She asks for you every night now, does she not?" he said at last. The question came out quieter than the rest of him usually allowed. Alana glanced toward the doorway where Lila had gone, then back to the sink. "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly when she thinks no one can hear her." Edward lowered his eyes for a second. It was a small movement, but it carried the weight of a much larger thing. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. The kind that arrives too late to undo a moment, but not too late to expose it. "Mrs. Green mentioned that she has been sleeping better on the nights you work late," he said. "I assumed it was routine." Alana folded the cloth once more, smoothing the edges with her thumbs. "Routine helps," she answered. "But being seen helps more." That one stayed with him. She could tell by the way he did not interrupt, did not challenge, did not immediately rebuild himself behind some polished wall of certainty. Upstairs, somewhere in the quiet distance of the house, a floorboard gave a soft creak. The sound floated down through the vents like the house itself was listening. Edward looked toward the doorway, then back at her. "I was not fair to you tonight." The sentence was plain, almost awkward in its honesty, as if it had never been spoken in his voice before. Alana lifted her eyes to him then. He was not looking for absolution. Men like him often did. They offered a careful apology the way they offered a tip, expecting the discomfort to disappear once payment had been made. But this was different. There was no smoothness in it, no performance. Just a man standing in the back kitchen of his own home, hearing his own failure without a room full of people to soften it. "No, sir," she said gently. "You were not." He gave one short nod, almost like the truth hurt less if someone else named it plainly. Then he looked past her shoulder to the sink, to the clean folded cloth, to the absence of the wine that had started the evening. "And still," he said, "you stayed." Alana let the silence sit for a beat before she answered. "For her," she said. "Not for the job." That was the line that finally changed something. Not loudly, not theatrically, just enough. Edward's jaw shifted once, then settled. Whatever power he had tried to display upstairs had not survived contact with that sentence, because it made something painfully clear. She had not stayed because he could pay her, not because he had authority, not because she needed his approval. She had stayed because his daughter needed kindness more than his house needed order. And there was nothing he could do with that except stand in front of it and feel smaller than he wanted to. "You should go tell her good night," he said after a moment, stepping back from the prep table and clearing the path to the hallway without making a show of it. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but Alana understood what it was. Not permission, not exactly. Something closer to surrendering the doorway. She nodded once. "Thank you." He did not answer right away. She passed him then, quiet as always, moving toward the hall with the same measured grace she had carried all evening. But just before she reached the doorway, Edward spoke again, and this time his voice had lost the last of its armor. "Miss Brooks." She paused and turned. He held her gaze for a second, longer than before, long enough for the silence between them to stop feeling like distance and start feeling like truth. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will not be discussing whether you are done here." Alana looked at him, not smiling, not triumphant, just steady. Then she gave the smallest nod and walked out into the dim hallway where the house had finally gone still. Behind her, the back kitchen remained lit in soft white, the counters quiet, the sink empty, the cloth folded clean. And for the first time that night, the silence inside the Whitmore house no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to the one thing Edward Whitmore had tried hardest to control and failed to understand until it was too late to deny. Dignity. And once a room has seen real dignity, power never sounds quite the same again.